Oh, we're not live on YouTube yet. Oh, we're live on YouTube, and then let's go live on Lobsters. We're live on Lobsters, so now we're gonna go live. Heck yeah. And then I think Trevor will join us soon. Okay, we're now live on Lobsters. Let me tag everyone, so that they can join the convo. So while I do that, let's just introduce the topic. So we are talking about the Jubilee video that came out last week. It was Jordan Peterson versus 2025 Atheists. And since we're the Latter-day Lobsters, of course we all watched it and we have opinions. I'm really excited. Let's just go around. Let's go around the room and kind of introduce each other. We'll start with you, Jasmine, and then Daniel, and then Matt, and then we'll pick it up from there.
Hello, I'm Jasmine.
There you go. Oh, I guess I'll go. Okay. I'm Daniel, and I like Jordan Peterson and Mormon stuff. So, yeah, there we go.
Very cool. Hey, guys, I'm Matt. I'm from Michigan, born and raised LDS, and I do admire Dr. Jordan Peterson. He's very well spoken, holds himself well under pressure for the most part.
Cool. So all right. So I watched the debate. Actually, a friend sent it to me while I was in church during sacrament meeting, and I was
Beautiful.
I was like running around the church, like, because Sophie likes to run around, like she can't sit still yet, and so she's like running around the church, and I'm just like basically chasing her and like just making sure she's okay. So I'm like, I'm missing the sacrament talk anyway, so I'll just watch this instead. And so I watched the debate instead of listening to sacrament, which I couldn't anyway. But yeah, my friend sent it to me, and he's like, he's a professor, and he's like, oh, yeah, this is kind of what it looks like when you're so used to like talking on Reddit, and then you like have to give a thesis defense. You just get like destroyed, And so I kind of have to agree. Like, they should change the title to Jordan Peterson versus 25 Reddit atheists.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because I did not think it was super. I mean, it was a step above average, but not super high. As far as
Well,
that
I think that's a lot of what, not just this, but what a lot of these Jubilee things are. So it's sort of like one like smart. Well, I mean, it's kind of what one smart person against 20 dumb people. Like, I mean, like that's not just like, even if you go like the Alex O'Connor thing, like there are people who did it, but it's just sort of like they come up. It's like one person who really knows what they're talking about versus 20 people. Although this one there's a little bit more of a disconnect with certain things. But anyway, we'll probably get more into that later. But that's what a lot of these things, these Jubilee things are. It's like, see one person who really knows what they're talking about against 20 like Reddit users who like feel like they know what they're talking about, but they really don't. Like that's what this format really is.
I mean, that's true. Jubilee, like they're trying to make a profit off the video, so they have to market it in such a way that's like it's like clickbait, but it's just higher quality clickbait.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
And they didn't even go over like the basics of like atheism, like the problem with evil and suffering and the lack of evidence, like just the basics. I don't know. They kind of look like they were in high school to me.
A lot of them did, huh? Like a lot of them were very young. I don't think there's a single older person in the audience.
Yeah.
They were all like kind of like in their like maybe like 20s, maybe early 30s. So that was interesting because Jordan was like the only like 60-year-old guy there.
I know. He's like time
I think it's also the demographic.
Yeah. So,
I mean, I think it's the demographic of who generally watch the show. But I think there was one guy who was in his like 40s or 50s. There was one guy who was like, oh, he looks kind of older. But yeah, most people there were like in their 20s.
When I think about it, like when I started listening to Jordan Peterson, I was in my early 20s. And at the time I had to drop out of college. So I was like itching to learn things. My circumstances didn't allow me to go to college at the time. And so like the intellectual content on YouTube is actually very good, but it does sort of like cap out. Like it kind of stays at like a higher up undergraduate level into like a master's level kind of level discussion. But then past that, it's hard to find like really high level stuff, which is fine because most people don't have that training, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really nice. You get a lot of his content, his higher quality content.
Yeah. So I wasn't super I mean, like, I had seen a few Jubilee videos in the past, but I wasn't super familiar with like the format, and I'm used to, and that, so here's the thing. I loved it when Jordan would debate other people, like especially when he was debating journalists and things like that, or if he was on a debate stage. But after his like benzodiazepine recovery, you know, he wrote an article, or he did an interview with the Times in England, and the particular journalist, I can't remember her name, according to Jordan, kind of did like a really, she basically did like a hit piece on him and like called him a schizophrenic, which is quite the thing to say. But then after that, he's like, I'm not talking to journalists anymore. And so then he started doing his podcast that was quickly absorbed by Daily Wire, where he has like panel discussions and guests. And that's a good side of Jordan too. And it's cool that he brings on like different experts from different fields. But I'm used to watching Jordan like doing like one-on-one debates with journalists and like people who are political, and then kind of them like hashing it out.
Mm-hmm.
So when I heard about the Jubilee video, I was like, oh, this is exciting. Like, I finally get to see Jordan debate again. I don't see that as often. But I mean, even in the preview, like I can even pull up the clip, right? Actually, let's pull up the first claim. Give me 1 second here. I'm just gonna pull this up. Let me share my screen. Let's see here. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Right?
That's the one that's really been going the rounds.
I mean, this is the part we for sure got to address.
This is the punchable atheist face. That's what this one is.
All right, here we go.
You're a Christian. You say that. I haven't claimed that. Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists? Don't be a smartass. Either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it? You're really quick. Okay, but you're nothing. Right? You're not a Christian. I'm done. Hello there.
Okay, right. So, I mean, that was the spiciest part of the video, right? Like, that was the spiciest, like the most derailed part of the debate, and for sure it was going to get a lot of clicks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think that the big thing there is, and this, I mean, that's obviously the one where it's like the spiciest part of it. But I think it's kind of a consistent theme is that Jordan in the video, he's kind of like, and you're not even just that, but like you hear, like I saw like Forrest, Jacob Hansen's brother, kind of say similar things. Like he's talking so much word salad. Like people say things that he redefines everything. But when you think, and he really goes over like the last girl who he talks to. He really kind of basically like really outright says this, is that Jordan's not talking. You have to remember this whenever he's not talking about religion or faith in some ways the way your typical believer is, because I mean I don't think he is one. Like I mean he won't say if he is or he isn't, and I have my thoughts on why he won't, but I mean he when he talks about it, he's talking about like in like symbolism and like and you can like get a lot of meaning from that, like especially when he does stuff with Adam and Eve. Like I think that's like very profound, like a lot of the insights and the things. Yeah. And some ways very Mormon, actually, even if it's unintentional. Yeah. But he's not thinking like, even when that girl at the end, like the last girl's like, well, you know, you're talking about everything like as a symbol and stuff. Like, what about like the real theological claims? And he's just like, oh, I don't really talk about that. Like, I have no, that's just not my area. I don't talk about whether Jesus like really rose from the dead. Like he says that directly, basically. Like she got us to corner him a little bit, but he just said that just on me. But when the atheists are talking to him, that's basically all they want to talk about. Like they don't care about his like symbols about how Adam and Eve are leaving the garden and leaving their innocence. Like that, they do not care about that. They just care about like, oh, do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Which is not what he. And so, but Jordan won't directly say like, oh, this isn't what I'm interested in. Like he goes off, and that's where the whole word salad thing. He gets like, what does that mean? What does this mean? And then he does this. They say it's redefining, and it kind of is. but I feel like it's more like it's just a more symbolic way of looking at it, which I think is fine. But you just have to understand that's what you're getting with Jordan Peterson. You're not going to get a big theological. It's more, at least like not in a supernatural, cosmic sort of way, which these atheists were not thinking that. That's why they're talking past each other the whole time.
Okay, so yeah, the claim about word salad is like a very particular claim. When you say someone's saying word salad, what they're like I'm trying to understand what they're referring to exactly. Like, are they saying, or what the sense of what they're saying is? Are they saying Jordan Peterson is sort of just like talking in a convoluted way that doesn't make sense, and so it's just a bunch of words mixed together, but there's no actual meaning behind what he's saying? Or are they saying something like, Jordan Peterson is saying utter nonsense? Or are they saying something like he's not talking in a way that I'm used to, where he's using words in the sort of like the way that everyone else uses them? So, for example, Jordan Peterson's conception of God is very different from other people. He doesn't even claim he's a Christian. And he reads the Bible. His interpretation of the Bible is very different than, I would say, the average Christian. And so, like, if someone is saying, well, it's word salad and it's nonsense, I feel like I have to. Oh, Matthew's trying to get in. If you're saying Jordan Peterson is saying nonsense, I feel like you're either not listening hard enough or you don't understand, because he is making like specific claims. He's attaching objects to predicates. Like he's actually saying things that are analytical, but a typical Christian might not say something like that. And then on the flip side, and this is just my personal bias, when I listen to evangelicals speak, even evangelical sermons, I have a very hard time following what they're trying to say, because they have a certain style to their homily that I'm not. I didn't grow up in that evangelical Protestant background, so I feel like the style in a evangelical homily is very different than like a Mormon talk at church, right? And the grammar is very different. So if I wanted to be charitable, I would say, well, I'm sure the Protestant Christian guy is making a point. I'm just not used to that style. Jordan Peterson has a very distinct style. And I think, and when I listen to him, when I think about him, Javier's joining. When I listened to Jordan Peterson back then, and when I listen to him now, I'm like, oh, well, I understand what he's saying. He's making sense. And I think he's making a very compelling case for how he understands God. But to say that it's just nonsensical word salad, I don't think that holds up. And I think the atheist types, what they do is they do something really interesting throughout the entire debate. The first guy would say something like, well, I was trained to be a Catholic priest, blah, blah, blah. And the way that you're talking about God is not the way that Christians in general talk about God. And it's like, well, yeah, he's an expert. Like he's a trained academic. Trained academics do not talk about the subject matter in the same way that a pleb does. It's hard to use that kind of comparison, but if you're highly trained, you're not going to think about it the same way that like someone who's untrained thinks about it. And so to say that he's doing word salad, I just don't think that holds up. But what the atheists do, they always try to pivot back. Like, well, they'll say you're talking about it this way, but that's not the consensus way, the general way that we talk about things. And it's like, no, but that's also not relevant, because I'm not making the claims that the general population is making. I'm making highly specific, formulaic claims that you're not willing to address. And I think that's where half the debate derails, right? Like, most people aren't willing to go there. It was
I was just like stunned at
So,
how it didn't lack. It had very little complexity, the questions that were being asked to Jordan. And like Jordan was very clear at the very beginning that atheists reject God, but they don't know what they're rejecting. So he had this idea that God is so complex that us as humans, we can't even like understand with our human minds how complex and how magnificent God is. And so like that fundamental like unknowing. And so how can like our finite minds understand such an infinite idea? And so it seemed like all of the questions that came after, they were reductive. They were trying to like pin him down to like, did this literally happen or not, you know? And it was very reductive. I mean, I it really was kind of thinking high school thinking. It wasn't very complex. And it wasn't enjoying complexity. Like people who really are academic or people who are really intelligent, they enjoy complexity. They enjoy the not knowing, like, oh, that's something new, like I'd love to explore that. And it didn't seem like many of the participants wanted to understand something that they didn't already know. They just wanted to shove Jordan in like a little box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do appreciate the two or three female participants that like did try to like dialectically try to understand Jordan's point. And there's a few interesting so Forrest is actually in the comments, so I'll address him. You know, he's saying, for example, what does Jordan mean in his first claim? What is his definition of atheist? He's the one mixing lexicons. He's the one saying atheists don't understand the God they reject. The atheist showed that his definitions are stupid. Maybe Jordan should ask, what is the definition of God that you're rejecting? It makes no sense to use Jordan's definition of God for the atheist rejection. Okay, these are good. These are good. I mean, they're good comments, right? And I would say I'm not going to address them all at once, but I'll get around to some of them. One of the things that I would say is pinning down any category philosophically is incredibly difficult. Like you could take any category, like you can take religion, you could take culture, you can take art, you can take I already said religion, but you could take other like even subcategories like the Restoration, the apostasy. You could take atheism. Those are all like kind of like master categories, grand categories, and then like slightly below that type of categories. And you can use all sorts of logic to undermine that category, right? So you could say, well, that category has different definitions and the edges become blurry. The definitions also aren't translatable across different languages, so maybe you're not actually converging on a topic. These different definitions are historically contingent, so they arise in a certain period in time, so they're not actual categories. They're just like the products of a culturally constructed period of time. Right. You could continue that critique all the way down and say, oh, by the way, the category itself is just a reification of something that, like, for example, there's no such thing as society. Society is just a term that we've invented to make that group real to us so that we can abstract and handle it. And it's like, you could pin down all those things and deconstruct all these categories all sorts of ways. What's interesting is that to Forrest's point, I think there is not a double standard, but something was overlooked, right? One is in Jordan, I think you even admit this. He says, well, it's a general claim to say that atheists don't understand what they're rejecting. We'd have to get more specific about it. But then no one really pressed him on that very well. They just kind of said, like, well, whatever you said is just vague. And it's like, okay, sure. But then when it comes to a category like God, I think the problem that Jordan has is actually the same problem that all Christians have, is that their ontology of God, or whatever, how they describe God, is like incomplete. That's actually one of the things that makes the category. It's like whatever God is, it's an incomplete, mysterious category. We can't capture it all. Yeah. So we can never have a super precise definition.
Well, and so Mormons are a little different than most Christians, because I mean, it is like, especially like classical Mormonism, we will become, the Father is the Son, or the Son is the Father, and the Father has a Father, and that Father has a Father. So our brand of theism is called infinite regress. And Jordan Peterson seems to be doing more of a classical theist bend, where he's saying God is absolute, he's infinite, it's eternal. So this idea of like that ultimate one being. So that's kind of where Mormonism and Christianity differ in their understanding of God. And so, yeah, just like what you're saying, it's kind of like what is society? You know, is there society within society, and at what time period? That would be more of the questions that nobody tried to ask Jordan in regards to God. Like, what type of atheism are you seeing in us, and what type of theism are we seeing in you? Like, there was no actual fruitful, real conversation about classical theism or infinite regress or reasons why people are atheists. And so that's why it seemed very reductive, like a very reductive conversation, kind of like a gotcha questions.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Jasmine that it just seemed very chaotic, and it didn't seem that the framework was identified enough to where you could have logical interchange.
Yeah.
I guess with the lens that you look through makes all the difference. So when I talk to, it's Alejandro, right?
Yeah.
When I talked to you, I said, hey, what are we going to talk about? And you're like, well, this and this, and how Mormonism solves those issues. So that's kind of the framework I'm coming in with. And I guess my thought process goes that, we've got all sorts of lenses that people look for or look through. And what Jasmine was leading on to we got these LDS glasses on, and we have a different framework on. And then we're able to sit back and watch the traditional Christian, whether he's a scholar or not, he's traditional Christian mind against mainstream rejective minds. So none of them really totally completely understand it.
Yeah.
But, in the end, what's happening is science is literally proving things that people have always, held as this big question mark. And science is literally proving, consciousness, and that makes a difference. And once those things are proven, and once those things are outlined and defined, that's going to be the unification. That's going to be the gathering of Israel, and that is essentially the wind that is going to push the arrow towards LDS, because there is no other truth that is as complete as Latter-day Saint. And that's just from my own processing of thought. I think y'all kind of agree. Y'all sound pretty faithful.
Well, some of us are a little less faithful than others.
I'm looking at you, Trevor. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, no, I came here to argue as an atheist. I'm not an atheist, but I came here to argue.
Nice.
Yeah.
Maybe. Well, you know what? If Forrest is still watching, he can totally jump on. By the way, just have him DM me, and then
Real
we'll.
quick.
Sorry.
I kind of so real quick, I wanted to address directly what Forrest said with the whole with what he said with like the whole what we said with what he said, like mixing lexicons, that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
But like I think that when Jordan Peterson says, this is this whole reason why they're talking past each other so much, like the atheists in there. And this is not necessarily what I believe. First of all, clarify this is what I think Jordan Peterson believes versus what they're talking about. So I want to clarify that too. Okay, but when Peterson says, "Oh, like they're trying to like when they say things like who gets to define God?" Like the atheists, they criticize Peterson for trying to use some unconventional, broad definition of God. That includes things like consciousness or ultimate value or moral order. But what Peterson's trying to do is he's trying to expand it beyond like the typical character or like what Sky Daddy, like what the atheists probably are thinking about. He's trying to expand it beyond that. Like they'll say they'll say the atheists, reject the Sky Daddy. But what Peterson is trying to say is he's saying that atheists typically reject a limited, literalist, maybe an anthropomorphic version of God, or the Sky Daddy version of God, or whatever, without fully engaging with a lot of some of the more deeper, more sophisticated conceptions of God with moral order. Well, actually, which I don't know if we'll get to this. I don't know. Where I think that at least some conception of. No, I won't get to that right now. Never mind. I won't do that. But anyways, with moral order grounded being the unknowable source of reality. So when atheists try to define a God in a way that's easy to reject, at least at like a fundamentalist Christian sort of level often. But Peterson does not talk about this stuff on a fundamentalist Christian level. He doesn't even interested in that. He's trying to grapple with a more very philosophically complex sort of a thing, which is why they go past each other so much. Like, because
Well,
he didn't directly say he's doing that, but he's totally doing that.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I took a class on Heidegger on my senior year of at BYU, right? And Heidegger's whole project is he's trying to outline what is a human being, what does it mean to be a human being, and like you talk to human beings, and you're like, well, it's this, whatever this is, right? But he's trying to sort of like articulate it in a way that's a little different. And so Heidegger's writing is insanely convoluted. It feels like word salad. It was the hardest book I've ever read. And I had to like reread it, and like kind of like really slow down. And he wrote it that way intentionally so that you don't sort of fall into your old way of thinking, because it's constantly challenging your old way of thinking constantly. But then at the same time, he's trying to say something new about what it means to be a human being, what it means to be. And so the things that he comes up with aren't things like, oh, well, we're physical, we're made of material. But instead he's thinking about attention and like, how does the object, how do I perceive the object, and how do I use it, and how's my perception working around the object? And so he'll say like, well, you exist, you are being, and there are things that are ready at hand and present at hand, and blah blah blah. I mean, I can't like unpack his whole thing right now, but the way he's talking about what it means to be is not like a materialistic Cartesian sort of way of talking about it, where it's like this cup exists on these coordinates in North America on the Milky Way in this cluster of galaxies and is made up of certain particles, and it's like sort of like this objective way. Instead, he's trying to sort of talk about being in a way that's like from the human perspective rather than from like an objective perspective. And so God, when you take that sort of perspective, isn't just, well, what kind of material is God made out of, or what's his height, weight, and length, but more it's like, what's our attentional and our existential relationship to God. And if you take it from that approach, it's like, well, yeah, God all of a sudden becomes like if God exists, the type of being that God is would have to be something like the most important being ever. And so when he starts to talk again about, well, maybe God should be defined as the thing we have at the top of our attentional hierarchy. It's like, yeah, that's exactly what it would mean for God to be like from, in relationship to human being. But that type of talking about God is radically different. It's fundamentally different than how people today typically talk about God. So is it convoluted? Maybe if you're not informed, but also maybe if you're not intellectually curious, it could be convoluted. But I think if you really pay attention, he's trying to say something that's different and profound about what the nature of God is like. That's not just your regurgitated atheist or even like Protestant evangelical way of talking about it.
Yeah, he even brings up Moses, he brings up Elijah, he brings up Jonah, and so he's basically expanding the meaning of what being conscious is. And so it's absolutely in that line. And the atheist arguments I continued to hear were very reductive. And you can tell from looking at these people that they're very young, and intellectual maturity actually does take time and it takes training. Oftentimes. And so I don't know if they had the brain power to actually be able to do that, considering the brain actually finishes developing at 26 or 27.
Yeah.
And so I think that there was a maturity issue there with a lot of the participants as well. And maybe they're not able to, because the prefrontal cortex, that's able to look at long-term thinking, creativity, that develops at 26. That finishes developing at 26. So if most of these people were under 26, maybe they couldn't even conceive of what Jordan is actually talking about when he's talking about the complexity of what God is, because they themselves have a hard time with that, and even past 26, a lot of us have a hard time understanding complexity and how complex extreme complexity can be. So,
well, I think
I would suggest that they. I was just going to say, I would suggest they were pretty focused on proving their point, Jasmine.
Yeah, very willful at proving their point instead of willing to learn. And the one who was very willing to learn, the woman, I prefer not to call her a girl, but the woman, she was actually asking him questions. That was very fruitful.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if this is super relevant, but I think kind of what you're describing, Jasmine, is kind of what Alex O'Connor describes as his journey through YouTube and debate and whatever. Like at first, he used to be a kind of gotcha, like what's wrong with this and this and that, and so long as I can prove my point, then I win.
Yeah.
But ever since who knows what happened, right? Ever since his change of heart, his cynicism has gone down dramatically to a point where his debates are more either introspective or exploratory in nature, I guess.
Yeah.
And yeah.
100%. I want to hear from the token atheists that we have here.
You want me to challenge you guys a little bit?
Sure.
I could probably argue as an atheist just as well as any atheist can.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's talk this through. So if there were a God, what you'd expect to see is a clear, unified revelation accessible to all people, regardless of time or geography. And yet, what we actually see is thousands of conflicting religions rooted in culture and location, in the time frame and the cultural beliefs of their day.
Okay, that one I actually think is a really I think that's such a not good argument, to be honest. And let me tell you why. Because here's the thing: if you believe that their God is there, and there's a God frequently interacts with humanity regularly, but rarely or if ever shows his face directly, you would get a crap ton of different interpretations from a lot of people. Some that are also totally way off from what the real God is. So the fact that we have all these religions, like they think that, we'd only have this one religion, but if he's like regularly interacting with humanity, but rarely directly shows his face, you would get a crap ton of different interpretations about who God is or what he is, even the ones that are like way off. So the whole thing is like, yeah, well, you have 1,000 gods, and which one's the right God? Oh, no, God.
Why does he have his face?
That really doesn't
I'm gonna go a level deeper.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna go a level deeper and say your argument rests on an assumption that belief in God is only valid if there's a unified, coherent understanding of God, and that's actually a Christian, like a Protestant Christian assumption that you've baked into the question. That's actually not valid. So it's like there's nothing. Well, there's a few verses in Scripture that it says, right, this is eternal life to know the only true God. But baked into that is we presume that knowing the only true and good God means that we have to all have the same understanding of the true God, and
Right.
so the different varieties of religious experience might inform us into a greater, more richer picture of what God is like.
Okay,
that's not necessarily like has to be uniform. And then when people go to war over that, that's a failure on humans.
So how does somebody find the true God? If someone's a sincere seeker, though. If someone's a sincere seeker, how does somebody find the true God and have certainty that they have found him?
Well, another true believer would probably say, I can't determine that for you. You have to have a personal relationship with God.
Okay, but if somebody over here says they have a personal relationship with Thanos, and and this guy over here says they have a personal relationship with Sophia, and this one says they have a personal relationship with Yahweh. Okay, so which one is the true God?
Well, again, that's sort of like, I don't know. I feel like the Thanos thing. I think that just sort of. I mean, I get you're just being like.
I feel like Thanos is actually a really good example. So I'll come back. I'll respond to that after you guys go.
Okay, well, maybe Alejandro will come back with a better understanding of this, but that just sounds like this flying spaghetti monster thing to me. But like, okay, but let's go like real conceptions of God. Like if you have one with Allah or Yahweh or other real conceptions, not the flying spaghetti monster troll conception. Okay, so like real conception of God, but like at the same time, I feel like a lot of that time it goes back to what I said, just because like people have different conceptions of what God is. Again, and he goes back to this. It's just sort of like if there is this God that's regularly acting with people but doesn't directly show his face, you're going to get a lot of different interpretations of what it is. You get different people calling him different things but that doesn't mean some of their ideas could be way off still.
As a qualitative researcher, I agree with Daniel in that people can read an interview transcript and come out with different interpretations. So I think there is credit to that perspective. Sorry, I interrupted people. You guys go ahead.
Why does God hide himself so much? Why is it, like, for a sincere seeker, why can't somebody come with certainty about who the true God is? You see what I'm saying? Like, why is it so hidden? Because I understand what you're saying, Daniel. I do. At the same time, I'm not an atheist, but I'm arguing as an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, why would God make it so difficult for sincere seekers to have clarity and certainty about?
So I don't think that God made it that way at all. That's my personal opinion. But before I build on that, I'd like to know these other gods that you speak of. They have a defining factor, just like you have that same factor as any other god, and that's free agency. That is your defining factor. You are a god. In order to be a god, you have to have power of choice. So with that, you are bound, in my opinion, by certain laws. And the question I have is, these other gods that you speak of, do they claim that they are the creator of all? Does anybody know that? I don't know.
I don't know either.
There's a lot of gods
So I'm assuming that if you are in the eternal world and you are a god, and I believe there are other gods, that you are bound by certain laws, by eternal law, essentially. And I don't think that it was God that has made himself so mystifying. I believe it was man's belief that disconnected us from God and the understanding of God. Because if I'm not mistaken, you go back in time, don't you go back in time, and Muslims, and we all started out with the first 4 chapters of the Old Testament. We're all unified in who that eternal God is. Now, we did branch out from there, right? And we did create, Greek mythology, and it's not necessarily a myth because there is truth, because, they started identifying gods, and, we have a sun god, and we have maybe the goddess of beauty, and so on and so forth. And these are different essential, you could call them energies, you could call them, any type of characteristic you want. It's like, Alejandro might be the god of, would you say you do qualitative studies and things like that? It's where you're defined. And then you go back to tie it back to Mormonism, and then your pathway through life, you are an intelligence, and you're combining your knowledge and information, and you're going to graduate this mortal realm, and write covenants and so on and so forth. You're going to carry on into eternal progression, yada, yada, yada. But to answer the thought process is why, Trevor, your question is why does God make it so hard for us to define him? And I'm suggesting that is because, 1, man is prideful, and 2, power structures that are in control pretty much messed up that logical thought sequence. Now, was that by design? Probably, because we got to get through it here on Earth. But you go back into Roman times, the Roman Empire kind of started everybody off on the wrong foot with this, state assumed Christianity that broke off into Protestantism and so on and so forth. So there's no way that anybody can have a logical conversation, in my opinion. I don't know what your thoughts are, but that's my 2 cents.
I'd like to piggyback off of that if I could. I like this idea of God is governed by rules that have always eternally existed, and it's not that he is setting the rules per se. And I think Alma 42 makes that pretty clear, right? He is bound by justice and mercy. At least those 2 are the ones that are outlined for us, right? But what if there are other orders and other laws that he is bound by? And it's not even a thing of like, well, I am obligated to do this any more than gravity is an obligation to us. I mean, it's not an obligation, it's just a condition that exists, right? Mm-hmm. And so what if there are celestial conditions and laws and things that exist out there, and our condition as fallen human beings, or just human beings, take fallen out, it's just that God is inaccessible to us, much like Wi-Fi would be inaccessible to a caveman, right? I mean, It's not that it can't be produced, it's not that it's impossible, it just With limitations, it's really hard to get there. So you have to
Can I give
dedicate your life to.
I like that.
Are you gonna pick both sides?
Can I give a rebuttal to my own?
Sure. I mean, that's why I do ChatGPT, and it helps me think. So go for it.
Here's my position. Here's my take on the problem of divine hiddenness, because divine hiddenness actually is a big theological problem. I would say divine hiddenness and problem of evil are big theological problems. My take on divine hiddenness is that, how do I say this? Okay, so there's a verse in the Bible from Paul where he says, eyes have not seen, nor ears heard, nor hath entered into the heart of man the good things that God has prepared for those that love him, or something like that, right? And there's another verse in Acts that says, in him we live and move and have our being, right? So my take is that it's, how do I say this? Okay, sorry. The verse I was actually thinking of is, for the natural man, what is it? For the natural man receiveth not the things of God for their foolishness to him, for the things of God are spiritually discerned. It's something like that, right? Yeah. Are you guys familiar with that verse? So basically, the idea is that God isn't something that we perceive with our senses, right? It's not something that we perceive with our eyes or with our ears, our mouth or our nose, whatever. Those are our senses, right? And so that's why that's why God per se is hidden, right? But God must be spiritually discerned. And so, the natural man, the way I take it, is it's like we want hard, objective proof that we can test in a laboratory, right?
Yeah.
Right? But the things of God, the spiritual things of God, are not things that you can look under a microscope and test in a laboratory. They're spiritually discerned, right? And so it's not necessarily that God can't be seen, but it's that it's kind of like saying you can't see sound. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're talking about a different mode of being. Go ahead.
We can't even see all the colors on the color spectrum. We can't even hear half of the shit that's going around us. We can't smell anything compared to
our spectrum of light.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I mean, God being hidden, to me, the question is very odd because it's our human minds that have the problem with reception.
Yeah.
I was reading a book lately, and it's critiquing postmodernism. But one of the central questions, one of the issues of postmodernism, is the question of what's real. And people will say something like, well, it's only real if it's mind independent, meaning if there were no minds around, would it still exist? And then the book will say, well, the problem with that position is that no one has really theorized about what it means for something to be mind dependent rather than mind independent. So there are obviously things that are mind dependent. What are those things? So, for example, an iPhone wouldn't exist unless a mind were present to have invented the iPhone. But obviously an iPhone is very real. And then there are other types of things that are real that are mind dependent, like the categories we make, like mathematical categories that we make, or cultural categories that are objectively real, especially for people in a specific field. And then there are other things that are real too, like, for example, social phenomena are real, but they're 100% mind dependent. And it doesn't make sense to talk about the reality of social phenomena in the context of a world in which there are no social beings. And so it's kind of like an incoherent critique. But then when I think about God, or consciousness, or even attention, or even things like your thoughts and dreams and emotions and subjective experience, it's well, are those things real? Although they're all mind dependent, they're still real. And so what the book says is, well, you have to understand real, whatever real is, and you have to contrast it to something else. So, for example, Joseph Smith's first vision is real. Joseph Smith experienced the first vision, but it might not be real in the same sense that I saw an event, like a car crash unfold on State Street in Provo, right? It's real, but it's not real in the same sense. And so its mode of being is very different. So God, it's very interesting because um, uh, God interacts with humans, and he's like part of like, oh, and here's maybe sort of like a small tangential rebuttal to the argument of hiddenness. That argument, in my opinion, just instantly assumes a conclusion saying that God is hidden and has been hidden for time. But if you look at the historical record and the anthropological record and the cultural record, there's like mountains of anecdotes of God appearing to us, but we as modern secular people tend to look at God in a particular type of way and determine, and we think about the real in a certain particular way, that when we say, well, God is hidden, we understand that in a certain secular modern kind of context that we should challenge, because I think there's ample evidence that God, it reveals himself across time to us, maybe not just to every single person, not in the same real fashion that like I see a car crash unfold on state and center, but maybe in a different way where it's where like our subjective experiences brought into the picture. Does that make sense? I feel like that angle of the debate is almost always ignored.
I'm going to challenge it. I'm going to challenge. So,
Go ahead.
Okay. So
I want to go next.
Okay, sorry.
You got it.
I don't mean to dominate. I'll shut up after this. But so you say that God's appeared he's revealed himself to different people, right? If that's true, why is it not consistent? Why is every record different across the historical record?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. Oh wait, did you want to hit that one, Matthew?
Well, I mean, what do you? I don't know the difference in the historical records and what the differences are exactly, but that is a great question. But I think, when you come down to it, you say, "Hey, what is real?" Right? Well, when you say, "Hey, what is real?" it's based on your belief, and I want to tie that into when Christ walked after he. Or not walked after he was resurrected, but do you guys remember the story? He went to his hometown and he couldn't perform any miracles. The thing is that in this very dense 3D environment, you're constrained spiritually by, I think a lot of it is belief, right? So the dead belief can drown out the spiritual energies and the powers and the so on and so forth. So you say, okay, well, what is real? And my thought goes something like this. Well, real is really nothing that we see all around us, because everything we see all around us is a product of what some might say observation. Because you get into the quantum physics realm, you start understanding it. Now you're getting into the essence of God. God is the great observer. He is the creator, because he basically exercised his energy. He said, this is wood, and now it grows on a tree. And then you look all around us, and everything is in a creative process. So that's the pattern of basically anything that one on earth might consider real. But somebody said reductive reasoning. I think it was Jasmine, something like that. But when I think that the sister to reductive reasoning is the way we frame things with our belief. So we can say, well, how come God doesn't show himself to us? And then the other way you could say it is how come I can't tune into God? And what I like about Joseph Smith is he kind of didn't really tell us the secrets, but you can see it in the mockers that mock Joseph Smith. And what am I talking about? So here we are talking about, okay, how do we know, who is God for one, and all them things? But he used a rock to translate golden plates that got taken up. Well, from my 3D perspective, that sounds pretty crazy. And I had a long struggle with that for a very long time, understanding how all those little pieces fit together. But as we are expanding in knowledge and awareness, particularly on the quantum front, we're also bursting the seams with quantum computing that actually compute data using energy from parallel universes. So Is what we see in this 3D existence really, really, really real? Well, you read the book, but is it really real? Well, knowledge is real. That's about the only real thing there is, and truth is real. But at a quantum level, it's all observation. So do you know how they talk about the great and spacious building and, everybody's laughing at you, joking at you? Well, that is social judgment. And what social judgment is, or what social judgment has the power to be, is that belief structure that creates reality. So if the Romans pull out the secret that God is an entity of flesh and bone, and they make him mystical, all of a sudden belief shifts, and now truth will always come through, but now truth has to process itself over 2,000 years. Here we are, 2,000 years at it, or 1,800 years when Joseph Smith revealed it, where we're starting to understand that things were obscured. So the sun is real and light is real. I get all that stuff, but it's in our universal realm. But in this 3D existence, I get a lot of information from a lot of different sources, and sometimes it's from a medium. And I know that the church, or generally speaking, churches say, hey, stay away from that stuff, yada, yada, yada. And I think it's because, it can set you off on a tangent that doesn't really make sense. But Joseph Smith had a rock. He translated plates that were taken up into heaven. Well, what does that mean to us? It means that he tuned into a frequency of understanding, tuned into a frequency of truth. And the rock was the portal. Why? Because it's the same type of thought process we use when we're talking about the very first radio that was made, where they use crystals to tune into channel 3 or whatever. So a different crystal would be channel 5, and so on and so forth. So the rock was a mechanism. But do you see how social judgment, everybody's laughing at Joseph Smith, ha 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 ha, he's translating with a rock. Well, the thing is reality is that's how you tune in. But our reality is that's witchcraft. So that's all I wanted to say.
Can I add a quick comment to that?
Yes, and then once you do that, I wanted to address the YouTube comments because they're just so much fun.
Sweet. It'll be really quick, and it's going to sound really stupid compared to what you said. But I think, have you ever seen an actor prepare to do a scene? Like, their preparation looks really stupid, right? They do trills and their faces exercises and whatever. But they do that to get in the flow, kind of thing, right? Same thing with like any artist, get in the flow. So I'm wondering if like there's a connection there too with like the spiritual way in which we get in the spiritual flow of things. The rock might look stupid, the hat might look stupid. Is that like some sort of spiritual exercise per se that gets us in the flow? Just make me think of that. I don't know if there's any merit to it, but that's what I thought as we were talking.
Yeah, absolutely there is. There's energy flow and resonance and so on and so forth. The actual rock is a medium. I'm not sure about the hat. They call it huffing or whatever, but the rock and the hat, there's also belief associated with it. So if it was a part of traditional social belief at the time for the people that did the hat and the rock trick, that you had to use a hat, then yes, then the belief plays a big part in that process. But I don't know specifically about the hat. But yes, the rock itself, the seer stone, I mean, even the Urim and Thummim go back into ancient times. That's not a Joseph Smith thing. Look into Masonic history. Look into the ancient teachings. The Urim and Thummim it's ancient. So
did Aaron have it on his plate, like when he was officiating?
They talk about the Bible.
Yeah.
I didn't catch that.
Yeah, I think Aaron. Yeah, from the tribe of Aaron. Yeah. I think the Bible in Exodus talks about Aaron having the Urim and Thummim and some other
like
gems or whatever on his.
Did they?
Chest
Okay,
plate.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they do. Okay. I wanted to address the YouTube comments because they're just.
No, we want to keep talking about this. Not just kidding.
Shoot, I already lost them. Hold on. Okay, so this dude said, Mr. Moto Shark, you believe Jesus and Satan are siblings? Facepalm. Whole planet is God from. I feel like again, this is like the Reddit atheist stuff, where people don't.
I'm gonna do you one better. Satan and me are brothers. How's that?
I know, right? It's like, well, right. I mean, the answer is we're all co-eternal with God.
Yeah.
So they're not even brothers.
The problem is
Yeah.
people say the
Well,
problem
I mean, first of all, I feel like that's just kind of like an even because they I get they have their whole ontological thing that's a big deal. But when people ask like, are Satan and Jesus brothers? It almost sounds like, oh yeah, well, you think that they're like bros, like they're cool.
Well, they're bros, they're homies.
No, like when I say
Yeah.
bros, they're like brothers, but they're really like they really like to they're like a lot, which is like
They're
not
brothers from another mother.
yeah, like that. I don't know. It's just such a weird angle. I get that like I think that there is a disconnect sometimes.
Well, okay. Here's what I'll say. I think this kind of answers Trevor's question about why do people have like a variety of experiences when it comes to the divine. The first answer is like the divine is very rich and multifaceted, so that's one. But second of all, it's really interesting. Like if you talk to an evangelical about Mormon claims, their criticisms come from a very different angle than when you talk to a ex-Mormon atheist, and they talk about their criticisms of the church. That comes from a different angle as well. And those two groups, although they're both anti-Mormons, are actually talking past each other in the debate as well. And so I think as human beings, we kind of have to understand one of the things about being human is that you're thrown into a historical time and place that you don't control, and that conditions your vocabulary, your categories, and all that stuff. And so if you even talk to people from different cultures about things that are objective, like the light spectrum, like the spectrum of light is objectively scientifically like described, right? But if you talk to different cultures, they have different colors for the color green, for the color blue. Different cultures in time have certain colors that we don't. You know, the Odyssey talks about the sky being the color of wine, or the ocean being the color of wine, and the sky being a different color, etc. Even though light and color, well, I would say the spectrum of light is objective, but our perception of color is very, very subjective, and so there's room for variety and richness.
Yeah.
I think the assumption that the argument makes is something like, if God is God, and if God is real, then he must adhere to certain type of assumptions about God, like something like what's the word I'm looking for? Like unmoving,
Unchanging.
yeah, kind of like these Greek classical categories, right?
Mm-hmm.
But first of all, that's an assumption, and we don't know that about God. And second of all, human beings certainly aren't that way, so there's no way they're going to be able to perceive and talk about categories from a Platonic standpoint. So the whole thing, I feel like, is just baked with assumptions that need to be challenged. And I think that when you watch the Jubilee video, here's a really good example. When you watch the Jubilee video, these atheists they're verbally fluent, but then they're not aware of the assumptions that they're making. So a really clear example is the guy, I think it was like the third question, which is something like, morality and values cannot come about from the scientific method or something like that.
Yeah.
And I actually disagree with Jordan Peterson on this, but for a different reason why the atheists disagree. So the guy gave an example. He said, well, Neanderthals and chimpanzees and stuff, they exhibit altruistic behavior, and so there you go. Science, morality can come from science, and that whole argument doesn't make sense because Neanderthals and stuff aren't using science, and just to say that you observe something in the wild, that's not science. That's just your observation of animals. That's anecdotal. And sure, maybe you use the scientific method to observe the animals, but that doesn't mean that the morals and values come from science. It actually is like outside of science. But what they're doing there in that debate is they're making what they're doing is they're doing what's called methodological naturalism, where you're assuming at the onset that the world and the phenomena in the world is natural. There's no supernatural. And so any explanation that you come up with already presumes that. And so any explanation that you produce is going to maintain and sustain naturalistic presumptions. And so here's the thing that's going to disprove all of this is there's going to come a time where you're going to use naturalistic scientific methods and you're going to have an utter failure in what it's going to be able to describe, and that's a form of contradiction. And so you're going to be like, well, our scientific tools can't explain this thing. And that's going to be like, yeah, maybe it's because your assumptions like aren't fitted to what you're it's not fitted to the phenomenon you're encountering. I think that's why Jordan Peterson actually says, well, yeah, I believe in God because of consciousness, and that consciousness is not a thing that the scientific method has been able to examine. And some people would say, well, that's God of the gaps. Interestingly, none of the atheists said that, which I thought was pretty low-hanging fruit. But I think Jordan is onto something where it's like, the assumption in naturalism and methodological naturalism is by taking a naturalistic assumption, we'll be able to explain everything using science, and then that runs into a contradiction because there are things that science cannot explain, therefore naturalism cannot be true. And then Jordan is taking that one step further, therefore God must exist.
Can I give you an explanation
of
science? Of science and consciousness and God and all that, and then I wanted to run it and bounce it off you. So didn't Einstein solve the equation E = mc squared? And can't we measure your thought? And as such, isn't your thought an electrical signature that can be transferred into energy, or transferred into matter?
I don't know. I'm not a physicist.
Doesn't that answer the science question about consciousness? I mean, it's kind of like it's right there in front of us this whole time. I mean, I could be wrong, but...
Oh, you know what? Was it?
Consciousness is so much more complex than that. It is really, really complex.
Well, you're right, because consciousness would be a collection of truths, whereas intelligence is really what the marker is when you talk about an electrical energy signature or a frequency. But as you gain resonance, certainly your consciousness, comes alive, it becomes sentient, and then you can experience different levels of awareness and so on and so forth. But didn't Joseph Smith give us the intelligence is eternal? And then Einstein said energy can't be created or destroyed. And now all of a sudden we have this 3D matter. Don't they all kind of go hand in hand?
That's a good question. I think I kind of understand what you're saying. And I think there might be a way to bridge kind of what you're saying. So, here's a great example. So David Chalmers wrote a paper. It's like the famous paper on consciousness where he says, well, we can't explain consciousness. It's the hard problem of consciousness. And he's saying neurological complexity doesn't account for consciousness, and neural networks and how sophisticated they are doesn't account for consciousness. And all of our mechanistic biological explanations don't actually explain in any which way why experience accompanies those biological mechanisms. And so we're left with the hard problem of consciousness. And what he said, he was really cautious about this. He's like, this is what he said. He said, maybe consciousness is like a fundamental thing. Like, for example, physicists, when they came up with gravity and electromagnetism, they didn't do that because their observations led them to believe that those things exist. They actually said, we can't explain the world and we can't reduce gravity and electromagnetism to other things. So they must just be fundamental and part of reality as fundamental constitutive parts of the universe. And that's how we came up with gravity and electromagnetism. Then he says, consciousness can't be explained by any of our methods. And so maybe consciousness is just a fundamental aspect of humanity. And he says, I'm really hesitant to say this, but I think this is the case. And I understand that this is a problem because it sort of introduces a dualism where we have physical, mechanical processes, but then we have this non-material, non-mechanical, non-reductive thing called consciousness that's a fundamental part of human being. And I'm cautious to call that dualism, right? Because that's what Descartes would say. In response to that paper, Daniel Dennett then wrote a paper, and he's like, hey, I don't like David Chalmers' paper because it opens the door to dualism, and I reject dualism. So I'm committed. I'm like philosophically committed to naturalism. So I don't want to go where David Chalmers goes and entertain the idea um, of dualism. And so my critique of Daniel Dennett would then be, hey man, if you're the type of person that says, take me to where the evidence leads me, you can't do that and then say, I'm willing to go with you up to the point where I have to entertain the idea of dualism. And so
Yeah.
and so the atheists in the Jubilee video, they are presuming, oh well, God doesn't exist. We can explain everything using science and naturalism. But then, as Jordan Peterson points out, Neanderthals and chimpanzees are altruistic, and they don't have science. So their sense of morality, if they have any, did not emerge from some type of scientific understanding.
Well, what do you mean by scientific understanding? Like evolution? Like, because they always go back to evolution. Is that what you're talking about?
Oh man, I got a response for you, my friend. There is no single definition of scientific understanding because every field has very different scientific methods that have different assumptions. And so in our culture, we just use the word science as a placeholder for what we mean as like knowledge. And so scientists are like, or atheists even are like, oh yeah, if it's not, science will explain everything. But again, like different sciences are using very different tools to measure very different things, to make very different kinds of inferences. And it's knowledge, it's a body of knowledge, but it's also not uniform. And it's very pluralistic. And so what we mean by science would depend on, like, I don't know, what are we studying in the first place?
Yeah.
We need the law of everything. And Joseph Smith pretty much gave us the foundation. The law of everything is truth, which is independent to act within the sphere within which it's placed, and intelligence, which cannot be created or destroyed and always was. So what is consciousness as a result of that? Hey, you, Alejandro, you're a perfect expression of truth. What do I mean by that? Well, here you are, you're a spirit child of Heavenly Father. What does that make you? A perfect expression of his truth. You're not the same as Javier. Javier is a perfect expression of God's truth in Javier's perspective. And even every single one of us are. So here we go. We're in the premortal existence. The only other thing we have in the premortal existence is our agency, because if there was a war in heaven and people chose Satan's plan, then we must have had agency. And the only other thing we had up there that we have down here is truth. So here we go. What creates consciousness is your choices. And there's laws of motion that are involved. So here you are, you're in the premortal existence, you're choosing. Your intelligence is basically choosing a different path than my intelligence. And now you manifest in this perfect 3D existence with a body, which is another expression of further eternal progression of perfect truth. And you grow into, and it's just magnificent. And that's why eternal progression is such a thing, is because it'll never stop. Your experiences are different than my experiences, and people that are hearing all this are making different assumptions, and they're going off on their own truths and combining it with my truths. Some of them are saying, no, I reject that. Some of them are saying, yeah, that sounds pretty interesting. So it's basically an expression of truth. That's the base framework from my point of view. So when you say science, yeah, you're right. They've all got different frameworks from understanding because there's no unified understanding. And what I like about the Book of Mormon is that it's pretty clear when Joseph Smith pretty much made it clear. Truth is independent to act within the sphere within it's placed, and you are an intelligence. So that's just kind of my thoughts. I told you I was a little metaphysical, Alejandro.
I want to move on to the next claim that was defended in the Jubilee thing. But before we do that, is there any other thoughts on claim number 2, morality and purpose cannot be found within science? Because we kind of tangentially touched on it, but I want to make sure we give it its due diligence.
Yeah, I'll add a quick comment. I'm always talking about this, but like I have this philosophy that history and science teach cold facts, which are numbers, quantitative data, right? Cold facts. And stories tell living truths. And so what we see with God and the Bible and the scriptures and everything is more of a story rather than history or science, right? So it's trying to describe our human relationship to the divine rather than to say like, here's the science of how God works and the science of celestial bodies and systems and like all these things. And even though, like, for example, the book of Moses goes a little more scientifical than the rest of the scriptures, even then its purpose is not to explain the God of science, right? It's meant to explain God, our loving Father. So I think science is not a good measure for God, not a good metric.
Okay, I want to say one thing real quick, and this is kind of like more of a tangential because, like, you watch when atheists usually talk about this, like, I mean, I get what you're saying. Like, there's so many different sciences to measure, like, you're doing different things. But a lot of times I found what they talk about is they like talk about evolution with this. But here's the thing: when they talk about, oh, we've evolved to become more empathetic and stuff, I think that argument kind of annoys me a little bit. I'll be honest, because a lot of times people, when I think about empathetic, I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm just very pessimistic, but I feel like you don't understand how unempathetic humanity really is, especially maybe more now a little bit more, but that's not because like you're better, it's because your conditions are better. You go back like even 1,000 years ago, it's like,
you just go back to 1940s, man.
Yeah, you go genocide. Like, well, I want to go back further because, like, even then they would be but like it was very common. Like, if you're like a Roman or something like that, you just like kill a whole village. Like, oh, they kind of just think, oh, well, you just kill your opponent's village. Like, that's perfectly fine. Like, they really that's really how they thought.
Oh no!
And like evolution takes millions and millions of evolution because like no, it's because of you were socially like maybe your social conditions are better, but you're not like evolved to be the super empathetic, loving person. Like that is not in your evolutionary biology. And it's not like you know what's in your biology? It is kill, or it is the Darwinian notion of dominance and kill or be killed. Like that is what is in your natural. That's why I think keep going back to the whole natural man thing. That is what is in your natural man, is the Darwinian dominance thing. So that this whole notion that's like, oh, evolution's making us more empathetic. No, it hasn't. Okay, maybe your social condition has, but your evolution has not.
Doesn't there have to be a unified truth, though?
What do you mean by unified truth?
Well, I mean, you're suggesting, and you're taking a Darwin point of view, and you're saying that the natural man is even perhaps a little bit, maybe even cannibalistic or whatever. But isn't there a unifying truth that would suggest that we all have the light of Christ, and that it's the conditions that surround us that force us into choices?
Well, no, I would say that that's true. So I don't honestly say that it's not the light of Christ is in us. That's the whole natural divinity. And I think that's sort of like the whole, there's that tension between those two things. It's sort of like the whole, I even post this on the Lobster Group, the whole, like, when we find, I don't remember the quote off the top of my head, and we find the what Joseph Smith said, the tensions or the different things. I would say, anyways, I don't know off the top of my head. That's when we find it. So part of those is like the natural man versus our inherent divinity. So I think it's more like a paradox that exists with us. It's not true. But I also would say that your natural evolutionary state is not the light of Christ. It's like it's the Darwinian urge to dominate and to assert all that kind of thing, and power or whatever. And Nietzsche kind of actually goes into that too. But anyways, that's besides. I won't go into the whole rabbit hole with that. But anyways, that's my thoughts now.
Okay, I'll try to be quick, but I have two major critiques of that, and we probably won't get into it here because there's a lot to say. But I have two major critiques of that. One, I don't think the claim is necessarily that evolution made us more empathetic as a whole. I think the claim is more that evolution, that we're tribal beings, right? So we have both sides of our nature. We have an empathetic, social bonding nature, and we have a more violent nature, right? Now, if you look at that through an evolutionary lens, it makes perfect sense because we are tribal beings, and so we evolved in families to survive, right? And so that cooperation fosters a good tribal community, right? And so there's cooperation within the tribe. However, outside of the tribe, those are the enemies, and that's where dominance, that's where like dominance and violence, all that stuff comes into play. And so, from an evolutionary standpoint, I think both of those make sense. The other critique I have is you have said that our conditions are better. Okay, underlying that assumption, what you're implying is that we don't have free will, and that our choices are a reflection of our environment, right? Which is a naturalistic paradigm based off of interactions of material, right? So, two major critiques. If you want to tackle those really quick. If not, we can just. I know we've been on this point for a while.
I love the way you're going with it.
Can I give like an offbeat but very Mormon opinion here?
I'm sorry, my computer kind of froze for a little bit.
Okay, so if the claim.
I'm sorry, my computer froze. I missed half of it.
No,
Okay.
Sorry, you missed it.
All right, keep going.
Okay, so if the claim is that morality and purpose cannot be found within science, I mean, as like restoration thinkers, we can kind of see that science can be a divine gift from God. So it could be seen as like an essential tool in the fulfillment of God's purposes. So instead of like morality and purpose not being found in science, it can actually be found through science. So this idea that science is a form of like ongoing revelation. So if the prophets receive spiritual truth, then scientists can, or even medical doctors can receive like material truth, which can alleviate suffering. And that would be in line with the atonement of Christ, which is what makes the restoration work and the purpose of why we're here. So it's kind of an idea that human progression is in divine collaboration using science and medicine. So like if we look at, I mean, we see this in the Book of Mormon, but we also see this in like D&C 88, that where we see that human agency is for the glory of intelligence. And so science to me actually goes hand in hand with the restoration and the fullness of the restoration. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. That's actually a very beautiful thought process that you just shared. They do go hand in hand, and Joseph Smith's revelations are so far out ahead, it's waiting for science to catch up.
Okay, so can I critique that? I'm sorry.
Go for it.
So you say
no, you can't, bro. I'm revoking your privilege. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, so you say Joseph Smith's revelation
playing God
are ahead of the game, and that science is catching up. So how would you respond then to the revelation, to the scripture in D&C that says matter is eternal, right? Matter, the elements are eternal, right? And yet what we know from science is that that's not true. Elements are not eternal. Elements began after the Big Bang, right? So elements were formed after the Big Bang, right? So that would mean that there was a point in time where elements did not exist, and then a point in time where elements began to exist.
So I think the same thing applies, that everything is a collection of truths. And I think you're actually bringing up a very wonderful demonstration of that. And the reason I say that is because we talk about an expression of truth. You're a divine expression of truth, but we also talk about laws. And we also talk about Joseph Smith's little key where he said truths are independent to act within that sphere. But we also throw in a little thing called eternal progression. We've got to deal with some sort of consciousness or whatever. So if we think of anything and everything as consciousness, it basically anything that is an expression of truth can be considered conscious. So when you say elements in this mortal world aren't necessarily eternal, I suggest that those elements that we're able to express in this world were a collection of truths prior to this world that allowed them to express in the first place. That's the way I would put it. I don't necessarily, I can't put it any other way unless I run it through AI in my framework and give you a better understanding. But in general, truths are independent to act within that sphere, within
So
their
are you
place.
saying, just to be clear, what you're saying that when you say the elements are eternal, what you're saying the element that is eternal is not necessarily carbon and oxygen and helium, it's our consciousness? Is that what you're saying?
So you say the elements are eternal. The truth that collected prior to, I do believe in the Big Bang. I really do, because I call it a consciousness snap. And what do I mean by that is that truths basically collect to the point where they can't be contained within that sphere anymore, and they have to express. So fire, water, wind, it all came together at once, and then bam, it all comes together. Now we've got the creation story to contend with. I understand there's a little bit of bridges that you have to get there, but in general, universes are expanding all the time, and it's a matter. I guess it gets a little sticky here, but yes, in general, anything that is in this earthly sphere is a collection of truths, some sort of truth that is able to express and manifest in this world. If it weren't so, the world wouldn't be here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It's very yeah. So I do believe that Joseph Smith, certainly his revelation is advanced in terms of society, because truth, society doesn't say, okay, let's go to Joseph Smith's book and understand the basic principle that truth is the primary factor. So if you thought of it in ones and zeros, it's a truth or it's a non-truth. And if it's a truth, what it'll do from there is it'll combine with another truth. And that's called compounding. And then as it compounds, the natural law is motion, is momentum, and then there's a law of propensity that basically allows it to express. So it's very, I don't know if like science can explain it that way, but generally speaking, I do believe that Joseph Smith had very key revelations that science hasn't caught up with yet.
Okay.
I agree with the general sentiment. Yeah, I think Joseph Smith was way for sure ahead of his time. He's a prophet, 100%. Let's move on to claim number 3. This one I think is actually Peterson's. I think it's actually his weakest argument. Also, I'll add one last thing to the previous claim about morality and purpose. It depends on who you ask. Like Nietzsche would argue that science has Christian values and morality baked into science already. So if you take that position, you can say, well, yes, it does because it's baked into the process. And then Peterson would probably say, well, then that means it came from Christianity. So you kind of lose the debate on that angle. And then on the other side of the debate, people like BYU faculty would say, science actually has naturalistic assumptions baked into it, and so that makes it devoid of morality and purpose. So then now you're like, ooh, so it must come outside of science. So it's a tricky debate, and no one actually, I think, got to the core of it, which is a bummer in that whole Jubilee thing. Claim number 3. Everybody worships something, including atheists, even though they might not know it. I think this is really in my opinion, this is another way of restating claim number 1. Atheists reject God but don't know what they're rejecting. And I think claim number 3 actually kind of specifies it a little bit, that the God that atheists don't understand is whatever the thing that they're worshiping, that they're unconscious that they're worshiping. And I think this is again, this is where it does get fuzzy, although the conversation did not lend to any clarity, which I think was why the atheists were trying to make things as fuzzy as possible to kind of get their win. They're saying, your conception of God seems one, not aligned with Christians. Again, Peterson's not a Christian, so why does he care about that rebuttal? 2, it seems to be so expansive that it could be almost anything. That's, I think, more interesting. And there were a few other kind of critiques of that argument. What do you guys think of how the Jubilee people handled claim number 3?
Well, first of all, I am going to say, kind of a side note, I'm going to say, at least in their defense, at least from what it sounds like, when they were invited onto the show, they were told, "Oh, we're going to do a Christian versus 20 atheists." So even though Jordan Peterson comes in, he's not really a Christian, certainly not traditionally. But at least in their defense, they came in with that mindset. So at least that's partially Jubilee's fault. At least they should have been at least gotten a little more traditional Christian, or specified, "Oh, it's Jordan Peterson. He's not."
Who would be a good one for that, by the way? Who would be a good representation of Christianity?
Jacob Hansen.
Jacob Hansen, yeah.
He was already on Jubilee. I mean, might as well put him on there. And it'd be a fun debate, right? One Mormon versus...
Well, he would do that. Actually, if I was going to pick a traditional Christian, I actually really like Gavin Orton. Like, I love his videos. I think he would, and as someone who's like outside of like Mormonism, he's probably would be my favorite one to pick. If I was going to pick one, like just general Christian one.
Gavin Orton, is that what you said?
Yeah, Gavin Orton. But here's the other thing. I think this is like, I kind of agree with you, Alejandro, when he said this is probably his weakest one, because like the other three ones, I was always kind of like, oh, you're being too narrow. Like you're defining it. You're not the incorporated atheist thing. This one, I kind of get what they're saying when they're just saying, oh, all you're saying is that people have different priorities, and then their highest priority is what they worship. Like that was kind of like, I was kind of like, yeah. I think that's kind of like, I mean, you want to call it worship, whatever your highest priority is. I'm kind of like, this is the one where I sort of sympathize with the atheist.
I have a critique of it too. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You go.
Oh, well, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, if I feel like when I think about that question, Jordan Peterson, the way he formulates the question, he doesn't say that whatever the thing that they worship is some sort of supernatural thing. Like, it could be a perfectly, like, naturalistic thing, that's not otherworldly. So I feel like they could have challenged Peterson on that front, being like, well, yeah, I mean, even if you were to grant Jordan like the expansion of the definition worship, it's like, so what? Like, what are you getting at? Like, it doesn't. Like, what's your profound point here?
To me, the point actually is more in favor of an atheist secular argument, because what you're saying is that like God is something that humans constructed, right, as an evolutionary mechanism, right? So it's like, because what I'm saying is like I don't know if you guys have read *Sapiens*. I haven't read the whole thing, but I read a good chunk of it by Yuval Noah Harari. I can't remember. It's actually a great book if you're willing to delve into it. He's an atheist, but he's really good about like the human anthropology and understanding like human evolution throughout the different ages, and how we've developed both biologically and culturally and sociologically and mentally and all that. It's a great book. One of the key points of his book is that one of the key things that allowed us to flourish as human beings is abstract thought, right? Because other animals can't necessarily think in abstractions, right? And as part of the abstract thought is gods and whatever, right? And so for Jordan Peterson to say that we all worship something, that's really kind of more in line with a humanistic secular standpoint. And you're just saying, like, okay, humans are worshipful beings, like to worship and believe in something abstract, right? And so just because everybody worships something and that's our nature, that doesn't mean that there's a God. That you should like that is more of in favor of a secular standpoint than a religious one. You ask me.
Looks like we lost Jasmine. Maybe she'll come back. And then
said she was going to jump off.
Oh,
do you guys know what I'm saying, or am I wrong on that? Like, what are your thoughts?
No, I kind of agree. It's sort of like just saying like it is. Like you could, I mean, I don't think anyone on Jubilee took it at that level, but it is sort of like, yeah, when you're saying that everyone worships something, you're basically just saying people are oriented to have some great high priority or some great ideal they have. I mean, doesn't necessarily have to be metaphysical. Well, I mean, it can be, or it doesn't necessarily have to be like divine or anything like that. It can be so that, yeah, that's probably why it's his weakest, is because it almost doesn't even. I mean, of course, he's not a traditional Christian anyways, so.
I feel like the one guy who kind of took the conversation to something like, so do nihilists worship something? And then Peterson would have to be like, oh, wait a second. they're kind of confused, or yes, they're worshiping too many things at once. It's not really focused. So their intentional capacity is all sorts of jacked up. I think that was actually probably like the one time in the debate where the person actually took Peterson's claims at word, not at word value, but like they sort of like took the concepts and then like followed them to their logical conclusion, whereas everyone else was sort of like, being wishy-washy about it. I think my problem is that it kind of like goes into this sort of like falsifiability territory, where it's like either way, like there's no way to falsify the claim, and every option you take like ends up in the same conclusion. So it's sort of like you're just presuming, you're putting the conclusion what's the term, like you're begging the question, right, where you put the horse before the cart. You start with the conclusion.
Right.
I think that was kind of like, in my opinion, not very strong of Peterson.
Yeah. Maybe what he was trying to get to is getting people, atheists, to admit that they do have some form of religious devotion to something because they worship that. But he didn't say that, right? So that's the problem, I guess.
Well, I think, at least when you're going to go in that situation with the nihilism thing, I think there is something to the idea. Like, even if you like have this idea of like, oh, like nothing matters. I guess I've never been a nihilist. Maybe I just don't understand nihilism. But I feel like you're gonna inevitably are gonna have something that you care about, or you you want to eat a vegetable all day. I don't know, but even if it's just like hedonism, or maybe like you love your wife, or I don't know, you gotta kind of think something. Maybe like you think in like the grand scheme of things, you're like just some speck of dust. But like you in your own life, you're gonna have to think, oh, I really care about this thing. Basically, what he's just saying is like this is like your priority. So whatever your high priority is, that's what you worship. So like maybe if you want to be like the hedonistic nihilism, you worship, your pleasures, or if you want to be more like, my family is the highest thing, then that's, even if you're a nihilist, like I'm sure there are plenty of nihilists who feel like that their relationships are the highest thing, even if they don't consciously philosophically think of it that way. I don't know. Like, so I feel like, what Peterson was saying is sort of like, well, something's going to come up as your highest priority, as your thing of worship, even if you don't like consciously philosophically feel that way. So I think that's probably true.
Yeah,
I agree.
I like Javier's point though, that I think that people should admit what they worship. You know what I mean? I think that's a worthwhile take from that claim. That like atheists need to be honest about what they worship.
Right. And in my mind, the logical next step to that would be what group, what tribe, whatever do I belong to, and therefore what religion am I, right? Because I think, and maybe this is more particular to me as a Mormon, but like when we talk about cults, and the usual attack on the church is like, oh, you guys are a cult, right? And sure, I'll say yes, but depending on what definition we use for cult, any group that we belong to is a cult. The lobster group is a cult, right? my gym group is a cult. My sister, she's a physical trainer, and she has a group of physical trainers, and they aid each other in creating meal plans and creating work plans and creating like competition plans, a bunch of stuff, right? And it's very much structured like a cult. Does that mean that it's bad, it's evil? Not necessarily, right? But it does mean that the level of priority that we give to it is religious in a sense, right? Because we devote certain attention to it. And not that I'm saying devote rather than like simply give attention, right? We are making it part of our identity. And I guess it would have made sense if the discussion would have gone that way, but it didn't. So, but to me, that would have been the logical next step of like discussing what tribe and therefore what cult are you part of.
So, here's something really interesting about. So one of the guys in the Jubilee video said that he had gotten a degree in religious studies, which is really interesting because one of the things that happens in religious studies specifically is they actually they actually criticize the concept of religion in the first place. So what they'll say is something like well, the term religion didn't really come into the vernacular until about like the 16th, 17th century, right when Protestantism was emerging. And so when the Protestants showed up, they sort of invented the term secularism to distinguish like the secular from religion. And so prior to that, religion wasn't really like a concept. There was like a few like ideas of religion from like its root, like religio, meaning to bind together. But really, the idea of religion doesn't come into being until like the Protestants invent the term secular. And so being religious is a category that is like in context of being secular, and so religion is actually a secular concept. And so prior to that, like they're basically saying like religion wasn't a thing. The way that people thought about religion, if they thought about it that way at all, it wasn't the way that we think about it now.
Right.
And really what they're talking about is something like a certain type of lifestyle where you're pious or something like that, or maybe even the sacred or something like that. What surprised me was the Jubilee guy who got a degree in religious studies, like I guess didn't get that memo, and so like he's still talking about religion as if it's like an eternal category that's been present across this whole time and isn't a modern concept. And so once you reject like the concept of religion, then the world looks very different, where you're not religious and you're not secular. You're something that's prior to all that has some type of like the world was enchanted and mystical, and you're just part of that environment, and it wasn't religion to you. It's just like you're just how you existed. And so from that perspective, I'm like, okay, well, maybe I can see where Jordan is coming from, where he's saying everyone worships something, especially if you deconstruct religion, then you're throwing out the secular religion dichotomy, and now you're in this space where you're not making those clear distinctions. So you're doing something that's similar to religion, that's like worship or something, but it's not framed in the terms of religion versus secular. So what's strange about that particular participant is like you would think that someone with that level of education would kind of like recognize that we need to move the frame of the argument past where, you know, it's been stuck in sort of like this new atheism for the past 30 years. And that's that's not the right starting point, you know?
Right. To his credit,
isn't atheism a religion though?
That's a good. Well, when you read Plato and Socrates, right? Socrates is accused of atheism. What does that mean? Well, there wasn't secularism back then, and so the understanding of atheism is you're worshiping foreign gods, so you're worshiping something else. So maybe, right? But the way that we understand atheism in our secular context, it wouldn't mean what it meant when Plato was accused of being an atheist.
So it largely comes down to definition, I guess, huh?
That's definitely part of it.
Because, you know, isn't by definition religion nothing more than a collection of truths? Therefore, history class can be a religion because it's a collection of truths. And I don't think that Christianity or Muslims or whatever aren't religions. I think they're all religions. And then they're like, are they true? And I'm like, well, yeah, they're a collection of truths. Of course they're truth. But do they have the authority?
If you read like early Mormon history, like Parley P. Pratt, for example, I think it's Parley P. Pratt, one of the Pratts becomes a Christian scientist. And that seems like a contradiction, but the other thing about science is that science is the word science itself actually doesn't mean like the hard sciences like physics, engineering, biology, or something like that. What it actually meant was something like an organized body of knowledge. And so kind of what you're saying, Matthew, it's like, well, and even if you read Nietzsche, he would say philosophy is the king of the sciences. Even though philosophy doesn't use empirical methods, it's still like an organized body of knowledge. And then he would say psychology is the queen of the sciences. And at the time, psychology did not exist as a science. And so when Nietzsche wrote that, so science itself is like a collection of it's like an organized body of knowledge. Truth as an organized knowledge of body sounds great, and I think that sounds perfectly in line with like how science was understood back then. And even Joseph Smith would say, "We seek truth from wherever it comes. We welcome it." And so when Parley P. Pratt or whichever Pratt it was becomes a Christian Scientist, basically what that means is he became a religious scholar and a theologian, and he like understood all the religion scholarship at the time, which is cool, and it certainly helped. I think it certainly helped Mormon culture become what it is today because he, again. Christianity and science aren't enemies. They kind of like gave birth to one another. So, well, yeah. So,
that kind of presses on the. I was going to say it kind of presses on the edge of revelation, doesn't it? Because here we have a Christian Scientist who studies different truths. Therefore, science is the study of religion, or a Christian Scientist is a study of the different truths, and so on and so forth. But my experience with revelation personally is basically recognition of a more perfect truth. So truth is always out there, anytime, every time, all the time, because it's eternal. It's our ability to tune into it and understand it and recognize it that brings it into our awareness that is essentially revelation. So when I found God after 50 years, and I found him a year or two ago, anyway, a year and a half, and I, was going through a really hard time, and my first awareness was, oh my God, you were always there. And it was me that wasn't able to tune into him. But when I found him, I understood that. So that's kind of the same way I see revelation now is that these truths are always there. They're there all the time, but our ability to tune into them, that's a different story. So when we frame our minds again with you guys are really smart, man. Like you're saying a lot of words I don't even understand. And I'm like, wow, these guys are talking, he's read Aristotle and Socrates, and I've heard about those guys and yada, yada, yada. But I think one of my thought processes is that I never learned those truths, so I was able to discover my own. So it gave me a very different framework from which to see the world. It's just interesting to hear you guys. I'm hats off because you guys are smart.
Thank you, man. It's good to have you here too, man. I want to move on to the last claim. I think the last claim is actually really fun. And I'll bring this and I'll read it and then I'll comment on it. It says, claim 4, atheists accept Christian morality but deny the religious foundational stories. This is reminding me of two instances. One was the example you guys gave of Thanos, and then I'm thinking of another example in I read this in the CES letter. Jeremy Reynolds at the end of the CES letter says something like, I watched The Lion King and I felt the spirit.
Yeah.
And does that mean that Simba and Mufasa were real? And I was like,
they are.
Well, again, yeah, right. It's like depends on what you mean by real.
Yeah.
It's like they're real. They're just not real in the same sense that like Trevor is real.
Yeah.
No, they're just as real.
But then
Trevor isn't that real.
But then I'm thinking about the Thanos example that you brought up, Daniel, where I watched the Avengers. First of all, I hate Marvel. Like I don't watch their movies. I'm like dragged to those movies.
They got cut down.
Man, I can't do it, man. It's just the CGI and the script.
I can understand some of them, but like the Avengers, bro. Like yeah.
Now I'll give you this. When I saw what's the one, not the one before, what's the last one? Infinity War? Xfinity War?
Yeah.
Endgame? Is it Endgame?
Xfinity is the
Endgame's the latest
internet brand.
Avengers. Unless you count them.
Well, there's the one about where Thanos was the main character, right? And
that's Infinity War, yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
that one was one of my favorite Avengers, like Marvel movies. I loved it. I was like, yeah, this was fantastic. And one of the reasons that I liked it is because they actually subverted the hero's journey, right? They made the Thanos, the villain, go through the hero's journey. So he does all the things from the hero's journey that Jung talks about, and he sacrifices his own daughter, which is awful, and all the things, and he becomes the hero. He defeats,
Is it sacrificing your own child? Is it that awful?
I know, right, exactly. Well, Jesus did it voluntarily, just so you know. Anyway, we'll get into Atonement in a minute, but that was I love that movie, and I know at the end you're totally destroyed because you're like, oh, I can't believe Thanos got the Infinity Stones, and he won the battle or whatever. But it was such a compelling story because they took all the archetypal elements and they just applied it to Thanos, and so. What's interesting, I can't remember how you said it earlier, Daniel, about why you brought up Thanos, but basically it's something like.
Well, what I said was I wasn't the original one who brought it up. Someone else said it.
Oh, okay.
And it was basically something like you worship Thanos or something. And what I said was I was actually trying to just brush it off. It's that just sounds like such a. Oh, it's because it was sort of different conceptions of God.
Yeah, different conceptions of God. Okay.
Yeah. And I was Thanos, his conception of God, that's like saying the flying spaghetti monster. That's not a real conception of God. That's a troll conception.
Well, I feel like Peterson's project is where he's taking all in Maps and Meanings in particular, he takes all these different traditions. He takes Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism, and he takes all of those, and then he sort of comes up with a framework where you can understand all of them, but you understand them at an archetypal level. And so when I read Jeremy Reynolds and he's like, oh, I was touched by the Spirit when I watched The Lion King. I'm like, yeah, I know you did, because the principles that converge between The Lion King and all these other stories and our morality and all this stuff, it's all pointing towards these moral concepts. Simba is Simba goes through the hero's journey, and Mufasa's the great wise father, and Rafiki is the shaman. Even though the Lion King is not real in the same way that you and I are real, the concepts that they're sort of symbolizing and representing, those are for sure real. But again, not real in the same sense that a cup is real. They're more real in the same sense that our ideas are real. Trevor, you were going to say something.
Yeah. So I want to respond to my own objection.
Okay.
So
that's what this whole episode's about.
So here's my take on the different concepts of God, different gods and all that stuff, right? My take is that if you actually look at, this is why I'm people, make fun of me for this. Maybe actually they don't, but I'm kind of into mysticism, right? So the reason why I'm into mysticism is for several reasons, but if you actually look at a lot of different religions on the exterior, a lot of them look very different, right? And those are the things that are culturally influenced, right? But as a religion progresses more towards its mystical side, right? They all start converging and looking very similar. They all it doesn't matter if it's Christian mysticism or Hindu mysticism or Jewish mysticism. They all start speaking of the divine in very similar ways. And again, it's still couched in their own language, but it's still very similar. So to me, if you understand that, then you understand that, okay, maybe there is a still ultimate reality that we call God, right? That is consistent across all cultures and traditions. So that's
yes, agreed. That's a wonderful thought process, Trevor.
Yeah,
because they're all true, and you're absolutely 100% right. And the only thing that stands in the way of any of us is our own pride. So their collection of truths as a Muslim nation, it's not that they're wrong; they're very right, but their insistence to stand on their truths in a prideful manner prevents them from receiving further truths. Mm-hmm. But there's only one authority. That's the difference.
And at the same time, we need to as Latter-day Saints recognize where we're being prideful, right? Mm-hmm. If we want to ascend to further light and knowledge, right?
Oh yeah, you're absolutely. That's my 100% battle is pride. Absolutely.
Yeah, you guys need to be more humble. You do, I know.
Bro, I'm the most humble person in the world. All right.
It's hard. It's really, 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 really hard. And Trevor hit the nail right on the head. When you are prideful, you prevent yourself from accepting a more perfect truth. And if you can't accept a more perfect truth, then you'll never discard a non-truth. Therefore, you can't ascend. So Trevor's totally right.
Discarding, yeah. It's really cool. Since we're talking about movies, there's this really cool movie on Netflix. It's called I'm No Longer Here. And it's about this guy who lives in Mexico, like northern Mexico, maybe Monterrey or something. And he's part of this group called Los Tercos. It's spelled differently, but the word terco means literally stubborn. However, they don't use it as that. They use it as just like, we're this group that does their hair really weird and like they dance this like weird kind of cumbia music and whatever. But anyway, the story goes that the narcos go after him basically, so he has to move to New York, and he moves to New York, but he doesn't really fit in, and he doesn't ever like completely integrate himself to society because he is no longer with the tribe, which used to be the Tercos, right? So like he still does his hair weird, and like he like does as much as he can to maintain his identity, but it gets to the point that he can no longer viably survive in the United States, financially, socially, and whatever. So what he ends up doing is that he cuts his hair, right? And his hair was the last thing that was tying him to the Tercos. So in essence, he is relinquishing his stubbornness, his terquedad, right? And as he does, it's this beautiful scene. He cuts his hair, and then finally he allows himself to cry and walks up the stairs to who knows where, right? But like the symbolism of like when we strip ourselves of being stubborn, we can finally rise. And it's beautifully conveyed in that movie.
Yeah, and it's true. And like when you, I love how the Book of Mormon talks about this too, where like I think it's Helaman 3:35, and it's also in Mosiah 3:19. It's like, okay, the natural man's an enemy to God, right? And will be forever and ever until he yields the tithings of the Holy Spirit. Same thing with Helaman 3:35, I believe it is. It's like the sanctification of their hearts came because of their yielding their hearts to God, right? So like that's a spiritual principle of yielding, like basically because like pride is what gets you like stuck, right? Where you're like, no, this is me, no. You know. But it's like yielding is like surrender, and that's when you can open up your heart to sanctification and your mind to inspiration and revelation, right? So
right. And I think that idea of yielding goes counter to a lot of the things that the world provides to us today in our Amazon and Uber and Lyft worlds, where things are brought to us rather than us give ourselves to. It goes counter to. And so I can understand that it's very difficult to accept. I like what Matthew was talking about earlier about this awareness that came through him through revelation. There was this lady on my mission that used to describe revelation as the connection of the mind and the heart. And when they finally come together, that's revelation, right? There are things I know here cognitively, and there are things I know here that are right. But when they come together, and they usually come together because I yield to God, then that is true revelation.
Yeah, it's a Doctrine and Covenants 8, in fact.
Yeah.
I got a good
heart thing.
I love what you said.
I got a good example.
Right, go ahead.
You know, when Joseph Smith, we came from Kirtland to Nauvoo, I don't know if he was a Mason in Kirtland, but he went to Nauvoo, and then in Nauvoo he became a Mason, and then all of a sudden we have temple rite and ceremonies and this and that.
Right.
So my dad we were talking about it once, and I was, something like, hey, Dad, Joseph Smith steal the, ceremony from the Masons. And my dad's like, well, do you think the Masons stole the ceremony from Joseph Smith? And that got me thinking. But regardless, the way I've come to understand revelation, and everybody's like, well, if he's a prophet, so we've got a lot of male or mortal judgment. If he's a prophet, he has to do this, he has to do X, he has to do Y, yada, yada, yada. But the way I've come to understand revelation is that you recognize truth, and then it's confirmed by the Spirit. So maybe Joseph Smith did go into the Masonic order and did walk away with some principles, and then he applied it to truth, and it was confirmed, and yes, now it's part of the temple rite, so on and so forth. But when you reverse engineer Masonic order, those are the guys that were supposedly the ones that kept the truth in the few, stripped it from the normal mainstream thoughts and held it within their own. So these truths had already been revealed. They're operating within an organization, which is their religion. Joseph Smith joins their religion, walks away with those truths. It's confirmed, and that's how truth progresses. That's how I've been able to put it together. Because you got a lot of people that hate on Masonic order. Well, sorry guys, maybe they know something that they want you to mock at and scoff at because they don't want you to know it. Because guess what? Social judgment is a weapon of mass destruction. All I gotta do is tease you, and you're gonna, I get shamed all the time, and I shut up. Everybody does.
Yeah.
I just want to say one thing about that real quick, just because this is going to be important, and I got to go, and I know that we're trying to wrap up here too, anyway. But just in response to that, I think that's really important for like anybody watching this, because as you dive into critical literature of the church, what you'll continually find is that there actually is pretty good evidence of source material that Joseph Smith used for XYZ, whatever, right? And for a lot of different things. I mean, you could say for the Book of Abraham, for Doctrine and Covenants, for Book of Mormon, for temple rights, everything like that. And like Adam Smith commentary on the Bible, there's a lot of examples of that, right? So a good way to, I think, characterize that or interpret that is, to me, the lens that I look through is like D&C, is it 8 or 9? I think 9.
8's the one where in your mind, your heart, and then 9's the one where it's like you took no thought but to ask him.
Yeah. Study it out in your mind and then ask him, right? And so that reveals the pattern of revelation. And so what that to me is saying that sometimes we think of revelation happens in a vacuum, and then it's like, hey, we just pray and then God just boom pours out all this knowledge that we didn't know before, right? In reality, the pattern of revelation, and this is consistent across the Bible too. This isn't just modern day, right? This is consistent across the Bible. Is that it's you study things out in your mind, and then you ask what's right? And then the Spirit can guide you to saying what's right and what's not. So it's like, regardless of the source material that influenced it, right? There's still deeper truths here. You see that in Genesis. The book of Genesis is full of influence from the Israelite era of stuff, where they have the Epic of Gilgamesh and whatever, right? So Genesis is a kind of a polemic against the Epic of Gilgamesh and other things like that, where a lot of the points that are made in the Epic are also made in Genesis, but juxtaposing itself against that, right? And so you say, okay, well then, these guys just made it up. But it's the reality is, the truth is, even if it has external influence, that doesn't mean that there isn't inspiration that's part of the process, and then it speaks of a deeper truth that is consistent for all of us.
Amen.
And so,
amen.
Yeah.
Right. So to me, all these influences that we see upon Mormon thought, it's kind of irrelevant, because truth is truth, right? And so if he's studying it out in his mind and he's asking what it's right, that's how we're guided with anything. So
yeah.
I think
there was. Oh, go ahead, Daniel.
I think a lot of the, not just that, but a lot of the atheist, well, I don't know, not even to say atheist, but the anti-blank religious things is a lot of them kind of do focus, I think, more a super literalist view, sort of the thing. And you hear Sam Harris talk about religion. He's talking about if you go to your fundamentalist Baptist church, it's usually kind of what he's talking about. But it's and that's kind of another thing, one of those disconnects in this video, is that's what a lot of these atheists, well, I don't want to say fundamentalist Baptist, but kind of more along that lens. And what Jordan Peterson's talking about is sort of that higher truth. I really love that video. Right? Yeah, I love that video where he's talking about, where he says is Hamlet true? Or it's well, it's fiction because it's not true. But well, actually, it's not. Maybe it's more true because it takes that experience from you.
Oh yeah, it's true.
Puts it in this thing where you can all see it, and that sort of shows the higher truth. It's yeah, and that's another thing. Is actually the people who wrote the Bible didn't have our post-enlightenment literalist mindset, where now there are people where I think take it too far one end, but I think at least, especially honestly, even as members the church I grew up, thinking that, you know, all the stories. I had a very, like, honestly fundamentalist mindset. My dad still does. Like, he's still like, if I somehow Noah's flood probably wasn't literal, or, you know, maybe at most maybe it was a local flood, he'll be like, no, that's blasphemy.
So that's a boomer thing.
But yeah, yeah. But the thing is that, like, just because it's not little, because people get caught up into this, it's sort of like, oh, when Noah's flood didn't really happen. Well, what is that against? Like, what's the huge? You kind of just get so attached to this. But the thing is, like, what about the higher understanding, the higher story that it teaches about, like, you know,
right,
about, you know, conviction, and like about, like, you know, being looked like to a higher. Even if you want to take out religious elements, which Peterson usually does, at least theological elements, which are like being like higher, like cleansing yourself of, like, I don't know, like what was the, like, I'm trying to think of the thing, like the cleansing yourself of, I don't know, like sin, or like going onto a higher level, or anyway, something like that. That's kind of like what, I don't know. That's what really kind of matters when you get it out. When you get it out of the thing, and sort of also the other thing is, I saw the dealing with, I don't know, there's a lot of these truths that we learn from the stories. It's the thing that makes them important isn't necessarily that they literally happen. I mean, where there is some exception to that. Like, I'm not totally going out where it's like, oh, everything's just a metaphor.
Everything's right.
Like, I'm not going that far. But like, a lot of the truth is that the things that really matter aren't necessarily like, oh, they like literally happened historically necessarily, but like the how we really, the transcendence that goes even above any of that.
Yeah.
I love what you say, but I do believe the flood actually happened, but I also believe that allegorically that you can have an overlay. I believe in the beginning that, you know, people and man were much closer to God. We've got stories about the Nephilim, and, you know, these circles are talking that the flood came to actually destroy the Nephilim, which was, you know, God seeded Mary, had Jesus, the Nephilim were seeding the women, yada, yada, yada. But the limited lens that we have to look through doesn't give us enough information. But, you know, we had the Sumerian archaeological understanding. You know, I think, you know, they had a X amount of years, I don't know how many years ago it was, but then they discovered Göbekli Tepe, which is like 9,000 or 900,000 years before that. I don't even really know the number of years, but what I'm getting at is that when the further you go back and you start stacking these truths, it's starting to make sense. It really is, because what do you make of the Book of Enoch? It's gone. They took it out. Why? Well, they didn't want you to know. So we had perfect truth. In fact, the city of Enoch, the whole city ascended. Where'd they go? Well, Christ, he's got a body. Where'd he go? And now, just now, you're seeing multiverses in Marvel Comics. Well, you're also, science is proving multiverses because the math points to multiverse. So Christ is here. He's all around us. He lives in a different dimension. That's where he dwells. He's a more fine and more pure. Well, that's what happened to the city of Enoch. Well, it happened back then. Then pride gets in the way. Man scrambles the mind or hides truth and sends us out about, and we got to go figure this stuff out all over again. Well, maybe the Tower of Babel, you know, maybe, you know, they were trying to get to heaven, or I don't know, they were building resonance boxes. I don't know what they were doing. But yeah, what happened at the Tower of Babel is a matter of interpretation. Did God scramble the language, or did he scramble man's mind to communicate telepathically?
Well, I think something that is kind of like what's really important is, even if you want to go like regardless of whether these things are necessarily true literally or not, or literally historically happened, again, kind of like you said, I think we get really caught up into that where it doesn't matter. Another thing that I think, what I saw in the comments were sort of like people get caught up is the whole like Kolob thing, where people get really focused on, oh God, the Kolob thing. But even when you like read about it, regardless of whether Kolob is a literal place, the thing that really matters is the symbolism behind the priesthood and Christ and all that kind of thing in the greater eternities, regardless of whether there's an actual, you know, body like or a sun where, you know, God, well, you know, planet where the sun where like God's around a thing where God is. That's not really what matters so much. as the story that it's telling us, or the symbolism that it's telling us.
Yeah,
So-
I think it's both ways for sure.
Kind of to bring it back to the original question, Peterson's claim, he makes this claim in Maps of Meaning as well, where he says atheists and modern people basically live Christian morality, but they reject the fundamental stories. I feel like the claims like that are ill formulated, because like if you make a claim like a broad sweeping claim like everyone, like there are people who are criminals that are both religious and non-religious, and they're obviously not following Christian morality. But I guess even to say that would say you would have to say something like the reason why we consider that person to be a criminal is because we accept a Judeo-Christian legal and moral system. So even if they're a criminal, they are playing sort of like that game.
Mm-hmm.
And in Maps to Meaning, Jordan Peterson, kind of does this archetypal analysis of the Christian stories and of other religious stories. Let me read the question one more time, because he says something kind of vague. He says this is terrible. He says atheists accept Christian morality. I think, again, when Jesus comes to earth and when he is in the midst of his society, he's 100% Jewish, right? The term Christianity doesn't even show up until several hundred years later. And then the reason why that term shows up is to distinguish it from Judaism, which also wasn't a term. And so Christian morality is like Jesus predates Christian morality.
Yeah.
And so I think the claim is false on its face. But I think what Peterson is saying is something like, I mean, all of our morals are basic. Like there isn't really, as far as I'm aware, like there isn't a unique secular morality that isn't borrowing from religion anyway, right? And then all religions have certain things in common, like the golden rule, and I don't know if the secular morality has that rule in it, but it probably would, because it's such a good rule. So they would basically borrow it from religious people. I don't think anyone in the debate actually did a good job of addressing Peterson's claim, or even I don't even think they made a strong case for their own critique of the claim.
Right.
We got to wrap up soon, so let's do like final thoughts and then wrap up. We're all good.
Everything good, Chief?
Well, I think
I'll go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
All right. So I think that you talk about the morality issue, and I'm not really clear on what the actual argument is, but I do know that Peterson wasn't equipped to answer it. And it's because of the framework. The framework suggests that Christian morality is what sets the standard, sets the tone. But even science has proved it, and as scholarly as Peterson is, I'm surprised he doesn't know this stuff, because and it goes back to the light of Christ. It's in all of us, but also we're down here to be tested. So I can't take the same test that my dad takes. So what happens is his knowledge and experience is handed down. I call it resonance. It's handed down through resonance. Dr. Bruce Lipton, who talks about epigenetics, calls it generational trauma. So we all have the light of Christ, which is that resonance signature of what I call home, or perfect truth. So in essence, Christ sets that tone, because Christ is the firstborn. He's the very first expression of the very first perfect truth. Christ is perfect truth. And our eternal resonance always, if you look at it from energy, always seeks to recursively go home to perfect truth. So we all got perfect truth, but we also got a test to go through. That's a Mormon theology. You're here to be tested. So what does that mean? You're here to inherit your father's generational trauma. Science has proven that it goes back 10 generations. So I don't think the argument is whether Christian morality is, the basis for good or bad. I think the argument is got to be reframed overall, because people are arguing, or they've got bits and pieces of information, and they're ill-equipped to even engage in debate, because that debate is for a final thought. Really, I want to say it was a waste of time, but what did it didn't really do much for any type of, nobody really, I guess in a debate, you want to walk away with some sort of clarity. I don't know if you guys walked away with any, I think you walked away with different points of views, but I don't think anybody walked away with any clarity. So then you say, well, what was the purpose of the debate? And it just seemed like a big power struggle to me. So that was my thought.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if this is to somebody's credit or discredit, but the format that Jubilee offers doesn't really allow for this kind of significance that you're describing. Just because, I mean, the whole thing of like you can get voted out by the majority, like that already sucks, because it limits you to debate for 5 minutes, which doesn't even allow you to scratch the surface, right? I mean, we've been here for 2 hours. It's barely given us enough time, right, so to speak. That, and on top of that, I mean, the audience that you're discussing with, I mean, to start off, like Daniel said earlier, it's not even that Jordan Peterson is a Christian, right? He's just talking about Christian ideas. So then it's already kind of off-putting, putting the quote-unquote Christian with the atheists, and I just think Jubilee's format doesn't allow for that.
Yeah, it's mostly an entertainment thing. I think that's about it. But
which,
I mean, I thought
it was entertaining. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, if you're not going to get scratched to the higher levels of understanding from Jubilee, that's not going to happen. But I mean, it's fun to watch.
Yeah. But thankfully, it does get us thinking, at least. So, and by us, I mean some people, right? Not just us.
I think that
you guys ever heard. I was going to ask you, did you ever hear the prophecy that Christ will come when all truth has been revealed?
I've heard something like that. Yeah.
No.
So never.
And I guess I've always kept that in the back of my mind. And that is exactly what we're here on this earth for, is to refine truths. So the refinement of truth goes through a sequence of combining, compounding, comparing, correcting, and continuing. That's the short version. There's actually 9 laws. So what we just did is we compounded truths based on that debate, and through that, truths are refined. So I guess there's people watching this. I didn't even really think about that, but now they've heard our points of views. I saw Alejandro kind of give me a nod when I suggested that maybe the Tower of Babel was about telepathy. Well, then I got that from Chief Mitiga.
Oh, Chief Mitiga.
You see how truth refines? Yeah.
Yo, there's been some drama lately. I haven't kept up on it.
I just saw about it today, something about how he got excommunicated, or not excommunicated.
No, he was suspended.
Fellowshipped or whatever. I don't know what the difference is between all this stuff. I guess in their church.
Chief Mitiga. I got to run, guys. You guys want to stay talking? I can keep this open. Or
no,
we
my
can
wife's telling me
I gotta go. Yeah.
I gotta go too.
Okay, you guys are amazing. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Yeah, thanks everyone. And then hopefully maybe we can get Forrest on here next time and all that. So I'm gonna stop recording.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.